Thanks, Ken, and hello, everybody. I hope you're excited to learn about composting today, because that's what we're going to be talking about. So we'll go ahead and get started. So what is compost? The EPA classifies compost as an organic material that can be added to the soil to help plants grow. Composting is a natural process of recycling organic matter, such as leaves and food scraps, into a valuable fertilizer used to enrich soil and plants. So some of the benefits to composting is obviously we can reduce waste. It's estimated about 28% of what we throw away are food and garden scraps. So that's a fairly large percentage. By using compost, we can also improve our soil health. Compost adds organic matter to soil, which can help with water retention, soil structure, and then we're also adding those microbes or microorganisms into the soil, which helps to promote a living ecosystem. Oftentimes from our compost, we receive macro and micronutrients. When we fertilize our gardens or our flower gardens, oftentimes we only apply nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are our macronutrients. However, when we use compost, we get the benefit of additional micronutrients that we don't typically add to the soil. So that's definitely a positive as well with composting. And then also, when we send our food scraps and garden scraps to the landfill, it often produces a methane gas because it's often in an anaerobic environment. And so by composting our waste, we can reduce the methane gas production from landfills. So with composting, there's two main types of composting that we typically will use. The first one is a cold or passive compost. And with this, it requires little to no maintenance. So this is a nice option for someone that's just getting started and isn't sure if it's something that they want to do for further years. It's a nice place to start. With cold or passive composting, it can take several months to a year to decompose, so it is a longer process due to the less maintenance. And in order to do this, simply pile leaves, grass clippings, and other materials on the ground or in a bin, and you can stir those materials occasionally. By shredding and chopping the materials, you can speed up the process. So the smaller the particles or the material that you're using, the quicker that it will break down. And this can be done either by mowing those particles. So oftentimes we'll put leaves in our compost pile and we can run over those leaves with the lawnmower and mulch them first. Or you can use, if you see here, is a mulcher that you can use for leaves. If it's large enough, you could also use it for tree branches just to make those particles smaller. Oftentimes, like a vacuum mulcher will help mulch the leaves, and that's also an option as well. The other type of composting is hot or active composting. This is a much quicker process, typically under the right conditions, so the right moisture, right temperature, right environmental factors. You can potentially have compost finished in 6 to 8 weeks. So it's a pretty quick process. When the conditions are favorable for plant growth, the conditions are also favorable for biological activity in the compost pile. So typically, like this time of year, when we have actively growing plants, it's a better environment for our compost pile. Whereas as we get closer to the cooler months in winter, the activity of our compost pile is much slower, and so we aren't going to get the decomposition that we would be having this time of year. So that's also something to think about when starting your compost pile due to like the activity of your biology. And then also with a hot or active compost pile, ideally you want to have a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. A high carbon and high nitrogen is better for active composting. The ideal size for a compost pile with hot and active composting is 1 cubic yard, as it's most efficient for heating. And then you also want to maintain a temperature anywhere from 110 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So since we know our two main types of composting, now it's important to understand what the main components are of compost. So first off, we want to think about what materials we're going to use. We'll obviously use plant materials, and some animal manures are acceptable. We also want to think about our moisture, as it's important to support the composting process. Another important component of composting is oxygen and aeration. Composting is an aerobic process, so we need that oxygen, and we need to aerate our piles in order to increase oxygen introduction into the pile, as it supports the breakdown of plant material by bacteria. It's also important that we have biology. So these are the workers in the compost process. They're doing all the work for us, and they're breaking down the materials into the compost. So these are our bacteria and other microorganisms that we can get from the soil. We also need to maintain our temperature. So typically we want to aim for a temperature between 135 degrees Fahrenheit to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, as decomposition is more rapid during this temperature. And then lastly, we have time, which is largely dependent on the above factors. So if our moisture is inadequate, our bacteria in our compost pile are going to be more sluggish, and the process will slow down. Again, if we don't have enough biology, or our bacteria are unhappy, they don't have enough nitrogen to feed on, they're going to slow down the process as well. As for materials that can be used for composting, there's two main types of materials that are used. We have our brown material, or carbon, which includes leaves, twigs, paper, and cardboard. Oftentimes when you think of these materials, you kind of think of a brown color, so that's a nice way to associate it. The brown material, or carbon, provides microorganisms with a fuel source, whereas we have green material, or nitrogen, which includes lawn clippings, fruit and vegetable scraps, and coffee grounds. These materials provide microbes with raw elements and proteins to build their bodies. So what exactly can we compost? Many of our fruits and vegetables are compostable. Often a lot of our apples, cabbage, carrots, celery. There's a lot of things not listed here that can be included. This is a partial list of everything that can be included. Later on, I will provide you with a link to more materials that can be added or used in your compost pile, as well as their carbon to nitrogen ratio. In addition to things that can be used, there's a lot of things that can't be used. Oftentimes, we don't want to include any dairy or meat products, so that can include butter, cheese, fish scraps, lard. A lot of times we'll have meat fat left over from our meat. That's something that you don't want to include in your compost pile. Other things that include oils or fats, which would be your salad dressing, vegetable oils, mayonnaise. It's advisable not to put those in your compost pile as well. Some people might argue with diseased plants. Some people believe that the temperature that compost piles reach will kill the disease of the plants in the compost pile, but I like to play it safe and not put diseased plants in the pile, just to make sure that I'm not spreading that disease. It's also advisable that you not put plants treated with pesticides in your compost. Animal waste. A lot of animal waste you can put in your compost pile. However, you should not put pet waste in the pile. Manure from meat-eating animals such as cats and dogs should not be added. Oftentimes, this manure contains pathogens which can be transmitted to humans. And so if you're using your compost for your fruit or vegetable garden, that can be transmitted to the fruits and vegetables. And so you could potentially eat those pathogens on what you're consuming. So do not compost pet waste. As for grass-eating mammals such as cows, horses, sheep, etc., that manure can be composted. It's a nice source of nitrogen oftentimes. Why it can be used is it's a much more stabilized, commercially processed manure that does not have pathogens that can be transmitted to humans. As for weeds, oftentimes we think, oh, weeds, they're no good. We'll just throw those away. But they're actually a nitrogen-rich material. So it's something that you can add to your compost pile if you're in need of some of the green material or nitrogen material. I would advise to remove the seed heads. Again, it's thought that the temperature of the compost pile could potentially kill the seed. However, weeds are highly adaptable to different temperatures, and so oftentimes they can adapt to those warmer temperatures, and there is the potential that the weed seed could survive in that temperature. There's also the potential that you may not properly compost and your pile may not reach those temperatures that would kill that seed. And so you don't want to take that risk of spreading weed seed into your garden or your pots or anything else. I would also suggest not adding perennial weeds until their roots are fully dried out. I don't know if you've ever pulled weeds before and you've left enough soil on the root of the weed and throw it to the side and come out a couple weeks later and it's still alive. Weeds are pretty resilient. They'll try to live through anything. And so if you throw them into the compost pile, there is the potential that they will still live. So we have been discussing the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Typically, the goal carbon to nitrogen ratio with a compost pile is anywhere from 25 to 1 to 30 to 1. So if you look at the table to your right, we have some commonly used materials in a compost pile and their carbon to nitrogen ratio. We see that with vegetable waste, grass clippings, they have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, and so they provide us with more nitrogen. Whereas anything above 30 to 1, a ratio of 30 to 1, it's considered more of a carbon source, and so they provide more of the carbon or brown material for our compost pile. And with those, you can see paper, sawdust are pretty high in carbon, which makes perfect sense. So these are just a few of the carbon to nitrogen ratios of many of the materials that you might use for your compost pile. If you would like more information on the carbon to nitrogen ratios, you can visit this link here. It has over 100 different materials that you might use in your compost pile and what their carbon to nitrogen ratios are. So it's great to know what the individual carbon to nitrogen ratios are, but then you have to also think about what is our end result or our total carbon to nitrogen ratio for our whole pile. And so we can go ahead and look at the calculations for that. So I've included an example. Our example is we are mixing 1 part vegetable waste with 2 parts grass clippings and 1 part leaves. So if we look at our table here, we see that our vegetable waste has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 12 to 1. So we'll take the 12 here and add it to the carbon to nitrogen ratio of grass clippings. Oops, sorry. Which has a ratio of 19 to 1. Because we have 2 parts of the grass clippings, we'll add 19 twice. Then with our leaves, we have a 60 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we add those all up and we get a total of 110. In the example, we know that we have 1 part vegetable waste, 2 part grass clippings, and 1 part leaves. So in total, we have 4 parts. So we take the 110 divided by 4, which is the number of parts, and we get roughly 27.5. So I rounded that to 28. So our total carbon to nitrogen ratio for our compost pile is 28:1. And we know that we have a goal of a total carbon to nitrogen ratio between 25:1 and 30:1. So that is a perfect place for us to be. Now, if math really isn't your thing, there are compost calculators available for you to use. That way you don't have to use the math. So Cornell and Washington State have a nice resource where you can just go to their websites and type in what you're including in your compost pile, and it will tell you your end result for your carbon to nitrogen ratio. This is an example of Cornell's compost calculator. So their calculator is just an Excel file. On the first tab of the Excel file, it gives you this chart here. So with this chart, there's drop-down menus for each of these ingredients. And what you can do is you just click on it, and it will allow you to enter any of these options that you see on the right-hand side. So you'll see materials. And again, there's a couple, I think over 100 different options of materials that you could potentially add to your compost pile. So you can add up to 4 different ingredients over here. And then down here in this calculated mixture carbon to nitrogen ratio, it will tell you what your carbon to nitrogen ratio is. So you'll also have to, you can kind of estimate, if you have a scale, you can weigh out how much you're putting in of everything. So here it shows that there's 175 pounds of urine, which it looks like someone's been drinking a lot. Hopefully that's water. And so that person put 175 pounds of urine. If you were doing like grass clippings and you were putting in 200 pounds of that, you could type your mass there for each of your ingredients, and it will give you the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Here they have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 35, which falls between 20 and 40, which is acceptable. If you're looking for a faster decomposition, you would probably want to aim for something between 25 and 30. Something else that's nice about this calculator is you can, it's not shown here, but you can enter your goal carbon to nitrogen ratio, and then it will tell you how much weight you need of each product that you're going to include in your pile. So you can start backwards. You can start with a goal of a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 25, and it'll tell you how many leaves you should add or how much garbage you should add to achieve that carbon to nitrogen ratio. So with this background information, let's go ahead and get started with creating our compost pile. You should first start by choosing the location of your compost pile. It can really be anywhere that you want it to be, but these are some things to think about when choosing your location. Ideally, you'd put it in a level, well-drained area. If it's not a well-drained area, every time it rains and if water sits there, you're going to have moisture issues, which can slow down the process. It can also create a smell that may not be very attractive. You would also ideally would put it close to your garden or where the compost would be used. This isn't necessary, but if you're adding a lot of scraps from your garden, or if you're going to use the compost in your garden, it would be easiest to have it close to the garden. It's also ideally protected from winds. Wind can dry out your compost pile. Also, if you're just using a compost pile rather than a bin, earlier on during the process, your materials are larger, and so those particles or materials can be blown around by the wind. You should also try to place it away from wooden structures to eliminate heat and moisture damage to the wooden structures. We do have active microbes in the compost bin, and so they will feed on bark, wood, etc. So it could cause damage in that way. Another thing to think about, as I had mentioned before, was moisture. So you may want to have it close to a water source, so that way if you do need to get the compost pile more wet, you can easily do that. If you live in town or somewhere that it's less attractive to have a compost pile or compost bin, it's best to have it at a direct view or away from residential structures. If you have any issues with the compost pile, like I said, if it gets too wet, you can have offensive smells, and so your neighbors may not appreciate that. You also have to choose the style or type of compost bin or pile that you would prefer. So here on the left, we have just a simple compost pile. You can just throw all your scraps in a pile and turn it occasionally. This is probably a good idea for starters, as you're not unsure if it's something that you want to become involved with, and you don't have to have a lot of investment with a compost pile. Some downsides to a compost pile: obviously, when you go to turn it, there's the opportunity for materials to move more, as there's no support, wall supports or anything to keep it in the pile, so stirring can become a little more difficult. We also have a compost trench or pit, which you can see on the right-hand side. And this is a fairly easy operation. What they've done here is you typically will dig down about 12 inches and you remove the soil, and then you can come in and throw your waste in the pit. Here you see that they have a lot of, looks like, fruits and vegetable scraps, which are higher in nitrogen. And so then they'll go ahead and put the soil back on top of the waste that you put in the pit, and then you just leave it. You don't monitor moisture, you don't monitor temperature, you don't have to turn it. It will just go through the process in the soil. You could potentially have some issues with this if you have a high carbon materials in the pit. The soil microbes don't have enough nitrogen available, so they'll start pulling nitrogen from the soil and using that for the process. If you've planted plants in that area, that's taking nitrogen away from the plants, and so you can have nitrogen deficient plants in this area. So it is good to have a balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio when doing this, so that way you don't have any issues with that. There are some options that you can purchase as well. So with this left one, we have a compost tumbler, is often what they're called. This one's nice as it has 2 compartments, so you can have a compost that's further along in its cycle, as well as a beginning compost or just your waste holding there until the other compost is done. There's also more bin type of compost containers. If you're going to buy these online, it's a good idea to read the reviews and see kind of what other people have to say about the compost bins. The middle one here is made of wood, and so there can be some issues with wood holding up in the outside environment. I read the reviews for this one, and there were a couple complaints about the sturdiness of it. After a few years, they had to replace wood parts of it. So that's some things to think about, like the durability and how long it's going to last. And then the one on the right is made out of a plastic material. Typically, we see plastic lasting a little longer in the outside environment. And 2, with these tall ones, you also have to think about stirring. Can you get to the very bottom to be able to stir it? This green one here has an aeration system in it, which has some mixed reviews as to if the aeration truly gets down to the bottom. So again, read your reviews and figure out what works best for you. When we started composting at first, We started with a compost pile, which turned into us just dumping compost on the ground. We never really got any compost from it because we weren't properly managing it. So we decided that we wanted to better manage the compost. So we went to this compost style. Some of the issues that we saw with it is you can see here with the legs, they are metal legs. And so after a couple years, they do start to rust and deteriorate. That is something that can be replaced, but we didn't have enough success with it that it wasn't something that we wanted to pursue. So we ended up switching to a different style. There are options to create your own compost bins. So here you can see are some concrete structures. Obviously with the concrete structures, you're less likely to have any wear and tear from the environment as you would with wood. So the concrete you would hope would hold up a little bit longer. Here on the right, you can see a compost pile where they've just constructed 3 sides to the compost pile, and then you can easily get access to the pile and stir it. With this one here, they have 4 different compartments, so there is the potential that they could have different cycles in each of the compartments. But typically I would suggest to start smaller. Maybe don't start at this level as it can become overwhelming. And then probably the most commonly used are wooden or like our pallet compost bins. So you see here in the upper right hand corner, there are just 4 pallets that have been wired together. This may not be the most sturdy structure. You may need more support than that. Something else to think about is how are you going to stir it? Unless you're like 6 or 7 feet tall, it may be difficult to get over the top of the pallet to stir this. And 2, if you were going to open up this front pallet, if your structure isn't the most sturdy, that may be difficult to do. So that's something to think about when building your structure. As I had mentioned before, we moved away from the compost tumbler, and we've recently moved to something like this here on the left-hand side. So we took 3 pallets and we did it on one on each side and on the back of the compost pile, and then we took 2 boards and put them in the front so that way it was shorter and easier to turn. We currently only have 1 of these bins. We don't have the second one. But going forward, that's something that we would look into. This is nice as you can easily turn it. It's a lower structure. However, when you're first starting with your pile, things can fall over this front edge here. And so I would consider going with something like this on the bottom right-hand corner. So that way you can add slats or take them away as your pile is larger, versus if you need to stir it. And then also as it gets smaller or as it gets further in the compost cycle, your materials do become quite less, and so it takes up less room in the compost bin. Some other things to think about when considering your compost bins is potentially having a multi-cell compost bin where you can keep waste that you aren't currently composting. You can also have an active cell, which is actively composting. It's going through the process. And then also a holding cell where you can keep compost that's nearly finished or curing. And so that way you can have a nice cycle of compost and be able to have more to be able to use throughout the season. Some other things to think about when building your compost pile is the size of the pile. So optimally, you would have a size around 1 cubic yard. It's not suggested to go any smaller than 1 cubic yard. You can go slightly larger as a 4x4x4 or a 5x5x5. Typically, if you go smaller, there's not enough mass to maintain adequate heat and moisture, so you can have some issues with that. If you get a compost pile too large, it can be difficult for air to reach the center of the pile, and it requires more turning, which creates more labor for you. Now let's go ahead and get started with building your pile. One option is making layers. So what you can do is you can create a 6 to 8 inch layer of carbon-rich material. So that's your leaves, your twigs, paper, anything of any of your brown material. And then follow that up with 1 to 2 inches of your nitrogen-rich material. So again, that can be your vegetable scraps. It could be grass clippings. If you're low on nitrogen material, you could also use manure for that. And then next, follow it up with 1 to 2 inches of soil or finished compost. And so what that is for is that's introducing your biology or your microbes and microorganisms to the compost pile so that way they can start their process. Another option is mixing materials together in equal parts. So if you recall back to when we were calculating our carbon to nitrogen ratio, we were mixing in parts. So if you want to do it this way, you could potentially use like a 5-gallon bucket full of vegetable scraps, a 5-gallon bucket full of grass clippings, and do it that way. So that way you have equal parts and you can easily calculate your carbon to nitrogen ratio. If you're low on nitrogen material, you can use other nitrogen fertilizers. So this would be urea, ammonium nitrate, or any other forms of nitrogen fertilizer. And again, we want to add a few shovels full of soil to add soil microbes and other decomposing organisms to the mix. There are some soil or some compost starters that are available online. Oftentimes they include fertilizer and microorganisms. I've never actually used this, so I do not know if it actually works. If anybody that is attending the webinar has used it, I would be interested to know if you've had any success with it. So in addition to building our compost pile, we need to make sure that we have the correct moisture and that we aerate periodically. Typically, we want to maintain moisture anywhere from 40 to 60%. The pile should be moist but not saturated. It can be difficult to monitor your pile moisture. There are moisture meters available. However, it's not necessary to buy one of those. You can check the moisture and compare it to the dampness of a sponge. So you should maintain a moisture to a level similar to a damp sponge. So you can just do that by feeling. If that's not the route that you prefer to go, you can look into compost moisture meters. If your pile is too wet, it will enter an anaerobic phase. So it's working without oxygen. And so those anaerobic microorganisms will take over, and this often results in bad odors. So going back to the compost tumblers, that was an issue we had with the compost tumblers. There wasn't a lot of air movement in those tumblers, and so we were new to the composting game. And so to us, we hadn't figured out the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so we saw moisture and we thought, oh, we'll put paper in it to absorb the moisture. Well, that was exactly the wrong thing to do, as we were adding too much carbon to the compost. And so aeration is the best method. Aeration, or like opening up the pile so that way you can get more oxygen and air movement in there, will help get rid of excess moisture. You should check the pile regularly to make sure it maintains optimal moisture. As I stated below, you want anywhere from 40 to 60%. If the pile is dry, it's recommended to grab your garden hose or a bucket of water and add the water to the compost pile. So this time of year, here in Western Illinois, we're getting really dry. We haven't had any rainfall for a while. And so this is the time of year where you definitely want to look into adding moisture to your compost pile. And then, like I said, aerating your pile. You can do this by punching holes in the side or by turning the pile. So if you look at this picture on the right-hand side, this is called a wing digger. And so here with the probe, you can see that it has these two little wings. When you push into the compost pile, the wings are closed up, and so they don't cause they'll easily allow for the probe to go into the compost pile. And then when you pull up, the wings pull out, and that allows for the aeration process. It moves the materials around and it allows more oxygen to get into the pile. So this is a nice tool. There's other things you can use. If you can find a sturdy stick, you could use that. I've seen people use ski poles to aerate their compost pile. Anything that you can kind of stab into the pile and get it moved about a little bit should work well. And this is a time when you can also turn the pile to mix things up a little bit. In addition to moisture and aeration, we also want to check the temperature of the pile. When the internal temperature of the pile reaches 130 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, again, you can measure that with a compost thermometer. That's not necessary. You can also do it by touch. So if it's uncomfortably hot to touch, you should start turning the pile. Again, this is your internal temperature. You don't want to just touch the outside. If you have like a cubic foot, maybe try to go in at least 1.5 feet and get the temperature there. Once the temperature reaches 130 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, you should go ahead and start turning the pile. When you're turning, you want to move materials from the center to the outs and vice versa. So you want to get a good mixture. You also want to make sure you're getting to the bottom of the pile and getting that mixed in as well. It's thought that if you turn your pile every day or every other day, you should be able to get compost in less than 4 weeks. I typically wouldn't suggest trying to rush this process, as you want to get it complete and you don't want to have any issues in your garden if you do have incomplete compost. Also, if you turn it, it's thought that if you turn it every other week, then you could potentially have compost in 1 to 3 months. So now that our compost is getting near the end, it's time to cure the compost. And what this is, it's kind of a safety net in case composting isn't actually complete. So you definitely want to make sure that your compost is complete. You know, you're during the curing phase whenever the pile will no longer reheat after turning. So you're not in those high 100-degree temperatures anymore. And so that's kind of the time showing that it's time for curing. Curing can last anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. And why this is necessary is because immature compost can have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio or high organic acid, which can damage our crops and plants. So often when we have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, we don't have enough nitrogen in that environment. And so those microbes will start scavenging the soil for nitrogen, and then that pulls that nitrogen away from our growing plants. How you can test this is you can put compost in a Ziploc bag and let it sit for 3 days. If it has a bad odor still, it likely isn't done. Another option is you can plant seeds in 3 different containers. One of your containers should have only compost, another one have potting soil, and then the other one have a potting soil and compost mix. And you can let the seedlings grow and see how they do. If the seedlings die, that's also a good sign that your compost isn't ready and that you need to let it cure for a longer period of time. A good sign of that it's ready is when it looks, feels, and smells like dark earth. I don't know if you've ever opened a bag of compost or if you ever used compost, and it just has that nice earthy smell. Often it looks dark brown. It's crumbly. It no longer looks like rotting vegetables, and it will have that nice earthy smell. So then, after all of your hard work, how can you use your compost? Obviously, you can add it to your garden. You can use it for potted plants as well. They are a nice source of organic matter, so when you add it to your garden, you can increase that organic matter percentage of your soil over time. It also can help improve soil structure. With these things, it's not something that's going to happen after 1 year. It does take a few years. So if you do have poor soil structure and you want to improve it, you want to improve your particle size, your aeration, and then also your moisture holding capacity, you can help do that through compost. And then also, as I had mentioned before, it's an excellent source of nutrients to plants. So it's not a huge source of your NP and K, but we're getting those additional micronutrients, which is always beneficial to plants. Another option that how you can use it is as mulch. So you can use it as a mulch, or you can mix it in with the top 1-inch layer of soil. And an interesting fact about this is there have been some studies show that it can help prevent some plant diseases. It's not going to guarantee all plant diseases, but you can kind of try it out if you've had an issue with plant diseases in the past and see how it affects that. So like I said, you don't necessarily know what percent of nitrogen your compost is, phosphorus or potassium. So you can get the compost tested for that. As you see above, not all compost is created equal. So depending on your mixture, you can have different percentages of your micronutrients and macronutrients. So if that's something you're interested in, you can send a sample off to get it tested. As you can see here, it is fairly expensive. So you just take a Ziploc bag and submit a sample of your compost that is representative of the entire pile, and that you can send it off and they'll give you an analysis of that. A lot of times we're doing kind of small scale composting, and so $45 per sample can be pretty costly if you're doing maybe 3 piles a year, or even just 1 pile a year. That can be kind of expensive to do. So that's something that you may think about when thinking about your analysis. Composting isn't an exact science. Through your experiences, you'll learn what works best for you. A lot of it is trial and error and kind of figuring out your mixtures, your carbon to nitrogen ratio, your moisture. It's not something that's just an ingredient list and you follow it to the T and it's going to work out. There's a lot of variables that go into it, and so you just kind of have to do your trial and error. One of the most common problems that we see is that it has a bad odor. You can definitely tell when it has that bad odor. It kind of smells more like a manure. And so some issues that you can experience with that is it doesn't have enough air, it's too much water. You can also have too much nitrogen. So like, Katie, that's 3 different things that could be wrong. How do I figure out which one it is? So easily though, not enough air, too much water. So you can easily aerate it or turn it. Let it wait a couple days, maybe a week, see if that odor goes away. If it doesn't go away, that may be when you added some additional nitrogen. So it's just some trial and error that you can go through to see what works for your compost pile. Here's some other symptoms. I won't go through it for time reasons, but you can read through it. The presentation will be online, and so these are some nice resources that you can keep in your potting shed or just with some of your notes, so that way you can use it as a resource if you ever have any issues. And then I also included this. It's just a nice resource that you can pull out of the presentation and again maybe staple to your garage wall or your potting shed wall and use periodically just to remind you of where you should be. So this is a nice resource from the On-Farm Composting Handbook. If you remember earlier, I pulled the carbon and nitrogen ratios from this same handbook. So this handbook is a pretty nice resource on composting. But this is just a nice table that combines everything into one table so we can easily access it and see it when planning our compost pile. So here we have the carbon to nitrogen ratio. If you look down in the notes, we see that the reasonable range that is based off of recommendations for rapid composting. But if you do get out of those ranges, you will still have successful results. So it's not like you have to be within those ranges, but it's a good goal for you to be at. We also have our moisture content. Obviously, we want to be anywhere from 40 to 65%. Our oxygen concentrations, again, that's kind of difficult to measure. And so just by turning your pile regularly and aerating it periodically, you can increase the concentration of oxygen in your pile. Particle size is something at the start when you make your particle smaller. Obviously, it's going to go through the process more rapidly if your particles are smaller. pH, again, that's kind of difficult to measure. There are meters for that if that's something that you are worried about, but that's a decently wide range from 5.5 to 9, so it does encompass a larger area. And then finally, our temperature. So the presentation will be available online. It's actually up there now, and so this link will take you to the presentation. I also have some resources here that are good resources to use if you are interested in getting started in composting. Like I said, the On-Farm Composting Handbook is a nice resource. It is a little dated, but it is a good resource that has all the basic information that you do need. And then we always like to improve. So if you have any feedback about this presentation that you would like to give me, I would gladly take it. You can get to the evaluation either by the link that is provided there, or if you pull out your smartphones, you can take a picture of the QR code and it will take you directly to the evaluation that we have set up. And then also, I think in your registration, you were asked if you were interested, but we do have a Good Growing blog as well as a Good Growing podcast. We write for the blog once a week, and then we also do the podcast once a week where we take questions from people in our area, pretty much anywhere, and we'll answer those on the podcast. So if that's something you're interested in, again, pull out your smartphone and you can take a picture of those, and we will get those sent out to you. And then finally, here's my contact information. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me or call and ask those questions.